By the standards of the world, I am sure I would be considered a failure when it comes to love. I've been divorced twice, and because of that, many people would either assume that I give up on love way too easily, or that I don't know how to love, or that I am simply unlovable. Because we prioritize romantic love and coupling in our society, I would receive a failing grade or at least an incomplete, given that I am now married for a third time, and if I can stay married this time, I might be able to pull my grade up to just barely passing. What's interesting to me about how we look at love when it comes to romance or coupling is that we often simply look at the endurance, at how long a couple has been together rather than the quality of their marriage or partnership. You can be married for 57 years and one person can be miserable or abusive or an emotional terrorist for 56 of those years, but still be thought of as successful when it comes to love because the marriage endured. By prioritizing the privatization of love into the love of a couple or even into the love of a single nuclear family, we have forgotten so much of what is important about love and how it can transform a neighborhood or city or society or world, let alone a life. On this fourth Sunday of Advent, we lit candles for love. And the hope in lighting the candles is that we would bring more light into the world when it comes to loving. Most of us would say, if asked, that at the heart of our Christian faith, at the heart of what Jesus came to do, is love. Queer feminist activist and author and teacher and prophet Bell Hooks, who sadly died this past week, wrote in her book All About Love that there can be no love without justice. And the story of Jesus, which many describe as a story of liberation, illustrates how love and justice go together. Love is nothing without justice. Love with justice means caring and working for your and the other's well-being in all ways. While it may seem odd to look to Joseph as an example of love, given that he was betrothed to Mary, who was much younger, most likely by some agreed upon arrangement that had nothing to do with asking Mary what she wanted, let's explore his story a little bit. The Gospel of Matthew begins with a genealogy to beat all genealogies. I have always found it a little humorous. It appears that the writer of this gospel is trying to trace the Jewish lineage of Jesus and to make the case that Jesus was the one that was promised by the prophet Isaiah to come to save the world as a descendant of David and Jesse. And at the very end of the genealogy is Joseph, the husband of Mary, Joseph, the descendant of David, Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus is born, who is called the Christ. Right here at the beginning of Matthew's gospel, Joseph is the key to maintaining the prophecy and the lineage, despite the fact that in the story that Dre read for us this morning, we are told that Joseph does not have sexual relations with Mary until after Jesus is born. but I'm getting ahead of myself a wee bit. In verse 18, we are told that the story of the birth of Jesus begins like this. Mary was engaged to be married to Joseph, and before they got married, Mary became pregnant by the Holy Spirit. Enter Joseph. Joseph is a righteous man, a just man, meaning he was virtuous and worked to keep the commands of God. Because of his virtues, he did not want to expose Mary to public humiliation or worse, so he decided to quietly break off the engagement. As he was thinking about it, an angel of God appeared to him in a dream and said, "Joseph, don't be afraid to take Mary as your wife, because the child she carries is from the Holy Spirit." Because that happens every day, so of course he shouldn't be afraid. But the angel goes on to tell Joseph that Mary will have a son. They are to call him Jesus because he will save the people from all that goes against God. When Joseph woke up from the dream, he took Mary as his wife, but didn't have sexual relations with her until after Jesus was born. There's much that could be said about this part of the story, but I want to focus on Joseph as an example of what Bell Hooks has said, that without justice there can be no love. The idea that love is not just a feeling, but love actually manifests itself in action. There's nothing about this story that makes it read like a love story. Joseph and Mary being engaged was an arrangement, a business deal. But as much as we like to say that Mary was chosen by God, wasn't Joseph also chosen in some way? Just as Mary had to say yes, so did Joseph. If Joseph had not said yes to staying with Mary, and if Joseph had not had virtues and been geared toward living according to the scriptures, he could have raged against Mary and either harmed her himself or thrown her to the people in the public square where she could have been stoned. Joseph was afraid. Think about when you are afraid. When we are afraid, we often act out of our fear instead of love or justice. Joseph did what he believed was the right thing after the angel told him so, and then took Mary as his wife, which kept both Mary and the baby growing inside of her safe. Joseph could have justified Mary's public stoning if he had acted out of his fear. I still think Mary is by far the shining star of this particular show, but Joseph comes in a very close second. He pushed through his fear and made a choice that had Mary's well-being and the baby's well-being at the heart of it, despite what people around him might have said. Fear is one of the strongest barriers to love if we let fear control our actions. Instead of justice, we seek revenge. Instead of compassion, we lash out. Instead of healing, we destroy. Instead of turning around and changing course, we dig our heels in and become entrenched in a way or an idea or a belief or a judgment. Fear is most dangerous when we are not aware of its presence and power in our lives. What do you think Joseph was afraid of. We have a good idea of what Mary was afraid of. She was a young, engaged woman who suddenly turned up pregnant. She could have been thrown out in the streets to fend for herself, or worse, she could have been stoned, with people thinking she had been unfaithful. As a woman, she had no rights and no way to support herself, and we understand her fear. But what about Joseph? Maybe he was afraid for her life just like she was. Maybe he was afraid for how she would have to live if she were thrown out, afraid for her safety. Maybe it was something even simpler. Maybe, like many men, he was afraid of being embarrassed by other people, thinking he wasn't good enough for Mary, or that she went somewhere else for sex. Maybe he was afraid of his own humiliation. Maybe he was afraid of never being able to trust Mary again. His fear isn't as straightforward as what we think her fear must have been, at least not in most of our minds, but he had to come to grips with his fear and make a decision about whether or not to take a risk right in the midst of that fear. Because he trusted the angel of God, he pushed through his fear to get to his yes. Love is a big topic, and you might be relieved to know we're not going to cover the whole thing today. What we might all be able to agree on is that in some way, love seems to be in trouble. We've seen the erosion of love in families, the erosion of love in couples, the erosion of love in whole societies, the erosion of love in communities, the erosion of being able to love oneself and one's neighbor. Over time in this country, we have prioritized certain forms of love. We continue to want everybody to think that romantic or sexual love is the highest form, and that it is between two people, preferably straight people, if you listen to those who fear queer love. We've isolated families and then held the nuclear family in high esteem because to do so is to prioritize those who can afford to be in a nuclear family rather than live in an extended family situation. We've prioritized self-love without explaining what it is and what it isn't. Instead of self-love, which works for the spiritual nurture of ourselves and others, we now have rampant narcissism, which is not at all about self-love and all about power and control. Love that prioritizes power and control is not love at all. We've prioritized love of religion more than the actual love of God. To use the Reverend Dr. Jackie Lewis's term for the state of our being, we are in a total hot mess situation when it comes to love. She wrote about it in her book, Fierce Love, which we're going to use during the season of Epiphany this year in January and February. Both Jackie Lewis and Bell Hooks claim that we can recover and return to how we love with justice. Bell Hooks describes the difficulty of defining love, and she suggests that Scott Peck's definition from The Road Less Traveled is a helpful one. In 1979, he wrote that book and said that love is the will to extend oneself for the purpose of nurturing one's own or another's spiritual growth. Early on in her book, Bell Hooks names honesty as one of the barriers to love, because in this country, Lying is a part of almost every aspect of life. And at the heart of how commonplace lying has become is fear. We lie about who we are because we're afraid of losing people. We lie about how we feel because we are afraid of hurting people. We lie about what we really think because we are afraid of sounding too this or too that. We lie in our families in order to protect people from harm or sadness or disappointment or embarrassment or shame, or in order to protect ourselves from any of those coming from other family members. Bell Hooks makes a case for how we are so conditioned to lie that we don't even know we are lying anymore. All of us lie at one time or another in order to please another person. Sometimes we lie to make ourselves look better in one way or another. It can be as subtle as saying yes when someone says, "Have you read this book?" Or when someone asks us, "Do you know who this person is?" and we say yes, despite the fact that we don't. We lie because we want to seem intelligent or educated or read up or any number of things. Woke, as Bruce said. We want to appear a certain way. We learn as very young children to lie in order to escape punishment or embarrassment. And that begins this pattern that stays with us for life. Bell Hooks writes, "The heart of justice is truth-telling, seeing ourselves and the world the way it is rather than the way we want it to be. If we want to be bearers of love in this world, we must confront our ease with lying, or at least our ease with withholding the truth. And to do that, we're going to have to face our companion, fear." If you want to do some reflecting this week as we prepare to gather around virtual and actual tables to celebrate Christmas, take some time to think about what you learned in your own family about lying and the impact that has had on you to this day. And that means things you learned explicitly and implicitly. You might have been told certain things, you might have been shown something completely different. Not every lie is a big one. Many families created patterns around ensuring that one or two people did not get upset or angry or emotional, and so a dance was created wherein everyone hid what they really thought or felt in order to maintain what ended up being a false peace. And then I invite you to think about other communities you are a part of, including this church, perhaps. We are, as a church community, and you might be part of communities that are called a chosen community or a chosen family. That means we're not forced to be together. We choose to be together. But that doesn't mean we don't lie to each other. Lying can be withholding, which means not speaking our truth. When I was a young pastor, I still like to think I'm a young pastor, but I mean like a really long time ago, there was a woman who everybody in the congregation loved, and she was immensely talented, and she was almost always hostile toward me in every interaction. And it went on for 2 years, and I could not figure out why. I finally sat down with her, I scheduled a meeting, and I shared with her my experience of our interactions, and I asked her what I had done. She admitted that when I first arrived at that church, she was jealous of my relationships with people on the pastor nominating committee that had called me. She wanted to be that close to me, and when she realized she wasn't, she felt angry and hurt. Her anger and hurt came out in every interaction with me. At the heart of her hurt, which is often the case with us as well, was this fear that she was not as worthy or lovable as those who were close to me. Fear leads to lying and acting in ways that go against love. We don't tell each other the truth about some things. We don't say no when we want to, and sometimes we don't say yes when we want to. Meals are offered and we say, no thanks, we're fine. Visits are offered and we say, no thanks, I'm way too busy, or you're way too busy. But wouldn't it be incredible if this community, or another community that you are a close part of, could be a place where we learn to push through our fear and be honest about who we are and what is and what we're thinking and feeling? Because love includes justice, it doesn't mean we would verbally vomit all over each other. What it does mean is that we would learn how to love by being honest and cultivating honesty as a deep value as we care for our own well-being and the well-being of others. Our families of origin are the first places where we learn about love, and because of that, I will be on a lifelong path of unlearning and relearning and hopefully transformation. So will most of you. Even if you grew up in what is thought of as a loving home, if you are aware, you will know that you learned some things there that are contrary to love. Whether it was patriarchy or misogyny or homophobia or racism or ableism or classism or dishonesty or addiction or violence or any one of 100 other things. Every single one of us was taught to fear, either explicitly or implicitly, and fear gets in the way of honesty, and honesty gets in the way of our ability to love with justice. Most of us got up and lit candles for love today. As you leave here to go out to bring the light of love into the world, what fear or fears do you need to come to terms with or acknowledge? How is that fear or those fears getting in the way of your ability to love? What are the subtle ways in which you might be lying, either to yourself or to God, to your family, to others, in order to keep the peace or to stay in a harmful relationship or to maintain an image that feels important to maintain? And the more difficult question is, what harm have we done or might we be doing to others or to ourselves by fooling ourselves into thinking that violence of any kind, physical or emotional or spiritual, can be compatible with love? Love with justice is a spiritual practice. And the invitation is that we practice it every day, and we practice it one day at a time. Bell Hooks was one of the people very early on to speak powerfully about all the intersections of justice and love and the interconnectedness of all of us. That means that my spiritual growth is connected to yours, and yours is connected to others, and we're all connected to each other. May we be willing to extend ourselves for the purpose of nurturing ours or others' spiritual growth. Amen.